All right. Well, thank you all for joining for this session. We have an exciting workshop with Zach Morgan from the Kentucky Chamber. He's going to kind of walk you through how he thinks about what to do with the data that they get from the demand planning process with their employer collaboratives. He also is the new lead project manager for, I think, one of the most exciting employer collaboratives in the distilling industry. So if you like bourbon, he's the man to talk to, but maybe after we finish talking about demand planning. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Zach Morgan to go ahead and walk us through his presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Nikki. Thanks for the introduction. And if you don't mind enabling the screen share option, I can pull up my slides. But while Nikki's doing that, welcome and thank you for coming in to hear more about some different techniques and processes for dealing with data. What I'll be trying to present this as is at the level of someone who's new to TPM, has never done anything with it before and is interested on how it works. But hopefully I'll have some couple of little tips and tricks that if you're a veteran TPM practitioner, that you'll be able to take something away from this as well. All right.
I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you just let me know when you need me to move forward.
Sure. That's why we do backups.
That's why we do backups.
So essentially, if I want to boil this down into one basic tenet, it's essentially that we need to be data investigators and approach the data as with as much curiosity as possible. And what to me is beautiful about TPM is that it allows us to really examine what the story on the street is, because there's always within an industry and in a particular location, there's always some kind of story about why there is a particular problem. And so the data allows us to kind of look behind the curtain and see, is that really the case? And sometimes we find surprises. So, okay, go ahead. Next slide, please. Couple of different steps and questions that I've encountered around data. There's a lot. So let's break this down and look at it one at a time. Go ahead, next slide, please. So how do you boost response rates? This is one of the first things that a TPM practitioner will encounter when they're trying to get responses from their employers, even on the first step, the first survey demand projections. So go ahead, next slide, please. I would say that it really boils down to, in my practice, it boils down to relationships and connection with the employers. They're more likely, and I know I would be more likely if I were in their seat, to respond to a survey, click a link, dig up all the info, put it in the web tool, if they have a relationship with me when I'm asking them to do something. So what you're looking at here is a screenshot of a template that I use to track the employers in my collaboratives, where as I'm building the collaborative, I start building this out to show, my next action steps, like have I put them in the web tool? Are they in our local chamber membership database? Do I have their email, phone, etc.? But then you can see as I move across the screen here, have I visited their facility? If I've done that, you can see not necessarily causation, but there's certainly a little bit of a correlation here as to whether somebody has not completed the demand projection survey. I have not visited their facility, so maybe that would help change that. So I would say relationships and connection are a great way to boost your response rates. Next screen, please. Another factor is clarity. This is a sample of an email that I'll send to an employer asking them to complete the survey. And what I try to do is keep these requests down to like a couple of sentences. Usually I will have already had some kind of a briefing for them where I've talked through, here's the steps, etc., and explained kind of the Here's the reason why we're doing TPM. So I don't have to go over that again in the email. And it needs to be really simple, like 2 sentences. People usually don't read 3 sentences into an email. I know I don't. And then really simple steps, like click this link to set up your login, click this link to take the survey, and make it really, really direct and simple. Clarity is key here. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so once you have the data, what do you do? What do I do? What's my process? I would say that my first step is to cut out the noise. There's usually, with any kind of data set, there's usually going to be a lot of extra stuff that I don't necessarily want to deal with, or is not really pertinent to the question, and seems extraneous. So go ahead, next slide, please. If you're using the TPM web tool, you'll be familiar with this view. This is the Excel sheet of data that comes back on the demand projection survey. So this is the aggregated data. There are a lot of columns here that are made available depending on how you want to crunch your data. Everything that's grayed out there, go ahead, next slide. I will cut out because it's not important for me, at least initially, to get some first views of the data. So I'll remove those gray columns. And what I end up left with is name of the position, how many people they need in new positions there, and how many they need in replacement positions. So very, very simple. Just cut out the noise. Go ahead, next slide. What I end up with is, these first 4 columns, and then I'll go in and just use a simple Excel formula to create the percentages. What percentage of all of the positions are represented by new or replacement, just to get a quick snapshot. It's a little bit easier to see that than just the raw numbers. And then you can see my totals at the bottom there. The goal here is, whoops, go back one. The goal here is really to make it as quick and easy, simple for people to just glance at and understand, regardless of whether they're a data person, because not everybody in the world cares about numbers and so or percentages. And we want to be able to make it accessible for somebody who is not, and then you can see, kind of how that breaks down there on the total line. But I also want to have the folks who do like to just look at numbers and just crunch them, I want them to be able to see it too. So I'll usually lead with this in a presentation about data, and show, like, here's the numbers, just look at the numbers. And then next slide, please. I will show them a chart or a couple of charts, whatever I'm seeing when I'm crunching that data. I'll pull together a chart that I think makes it look even more apparent exactly what's going on there. This is a chart type that I stumbled upon as I was looking for ones that made the information make sense. Often I will count the number of respondents for each particular position, because that can give us an indication, not necessarily, it definitely has to be discussed, but usually it will give an indication of, here's something that should be discussed before we jump right to that. The question of, is the largest number indicate this is the most critical position? In the TPM world, we know that is not the case all the time. Criticality can also include, business function or difficulty of hiring, difficulty of recruiting. So this is one way to kind of pull that discussion out. What you see in the gray line there is the number of respondents per position. So, some employers don't have certain positions, and so they're not responding. So, for example, on this slide, we can see, actually on the far right, the event staff. There were 11 companies that responded that they needed event staff, but event staff is very low compared to, tour guides and machine operators. So that would be a facilitation question that I would bring up in the meeting. Hey, looks like a lot of you are looking for event staff. It's not the highest number, but let's discuss how critical that is, as opposed to tour guide, machine operator, etc. By the way, if you're curious about that chart type in Excel, it's called a combo chart. And then specifically, there's several options if you go in there and you start using that combo chart. And then the type is clustered column line on secondary axis. So if you're curious about that, you can send me a message and I'll walk you through it. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we've presented the data. If there was something that was surprising or that I didn't understand, how did I uncover what it would reveal? Go ahead, next slide. I think this is really where TPM will usually bump into what the story on the street is. So we do all the data collection, and then this is where that data kind of runs into what everyone has been saying about what the problem is, and we get to solve that. So in the case of the healthcare collaborative in the northeast part of Kentucky, the story on the street was Maysville Community College is our local college, and we don't have enough RNs, therefore Maysville is not producing enough RNs. When we went through the data and we analyzed the demand, how many RNs they needed across the strategy for the back mapping data, saying where did our RNs come from, it showed that Maysville was producing exactly as many RNs as they needed. The problem turned out to be retention. So they were getting as many as they needed from Maysville Community College, but they were sticking around for maybe a year and then taking off to a metro area. So that's one example of how the data can surprise us and show. And we have to use that. In that case, we had to use that in combination, not just looking at the demand projections and not just looking at the back mapping, but put those two pieces of data together to figure out what's the real story here behind these numbers. Go ahead, next slide, please. TPM data also helps us see if the industry is more complex than we first understood. So this is an example of how we break apart the job descriptions in strategy 3. This is what we did with the Distilling Association collaborative, that pilot collaborative. And they initially were saying, okay, we want to look at tour guides, maintenance specialists, and machine operators. Well, as we started breaking apart their job descriptions for machine operator, and we got a couple of the distillers on the line and said, hey, can you walk us through this, make sure that we're on the right track here? They said, no, these are really two different positions, entry level and advanced, because some of these things we wouldn't want somebody who's just coming into the job to be doing. And so that data, if I had been left to do it on my own, I would never have been able to sort it out. And so I think one of the keys with surprising or confusing information is, again, TPM is employer led. Get the employers in the room. And one of the techniques that I've used with that is get a couple of your most engaged employers from the collaborative, because you know who they are. If you've been in a meeting, maybe even two collaborative meetings, you'll have a couple of them who show up to every single meeting, and they always say something to help move the conversation forward. Grab them, pull them to the side, say, hey, I need your help with this problem. And I've found that it's usually helpful to get, maybe two or three. In this case, that's what we did. We got about 3 different employers to come onto a Zoom call. In this case, we got one who was from a large distillery, another one who's a very small startup distillery, so that we had a good cross-section kind of representative sample of employers, so that we had a good, clear picture of what this was telling us. Go ahead, next slide, please. Another thing is just paying attention to the employers as you move through the conversation in each of the different steps in your different collaborative meetings. Pay attention to what's going on, maybe under the surface or between the lines. One of the things that came up often was the question of, while this is really complex industry, you know, our distillery is different than other distilleries. Well, they're all different from each other, and that's a beautiful thing. But we need to be able to show and communicate really to the job seekers out there, what are some of the through lines. Like how could you plan out, for example, a 20-year career in the distilling industry, because there may not be a lot of understanding, because it is a somewhat small industry. It's growing, but it's somewhat small, and so there may not be a lot of understanding in the public eye as to what the opportunities are. And so what you see here is an example of a career pathway document that I'm working to build with the employers. And this is really fashioned off of something that Lori Mays did with her equine collaboratives. She talked in the last session, where what this will eventually turn into is a one-pager that shows at entry level, middle, and higher skilled levels of work, here are the positions that are available to you. But even deeper than that, here's exactly what you'll need to have under your belt before you try to get that position. And here's what you could expect to make in terms of salary or benefits. And then here are some possible places that you could advance to beyond that. So across the bottom here, you see several different areas. So we first broke it out to, production, hospitality, management, R&D, and marketing. The employers were indicating that these are really 5 separate areas and 5 different pathways. And what I'm expecting that we will find is that there are places in each of these sheets where it may jump to another. So let's say you get an entry level position in production, and then after that you could jump into a position in marketing, or another, something equivalent, like a lateral move to hospitality, that sort of thing. So this is going to be pretty complex. It's going to take quite a bit of work, but the output is going to be something that hopefully will be a way for the employers to communicate really clearly to job seekers around the state and beyond what their career could look like. This isn't technically a TPM solution, but I expect it will be something that will support the solutions that we put in place in terms of being a communications item. Next slide, please. So once I've got the data and I've crunched it, how do I get to the point where I feel comfortable leading the discussion? It's a lot of information, and I'm not a subject matter expert on any of it. I'm also not technically a data person. All my degrees are in the humanities. And so that's a pretty hefty place to be in, going into a discussion with some employers talking about their data. So how do I get comfortable doing that? I'd say that the one key difference between data meetings with the collaboratives that went well and those that went poorly is, next slide, please, practice. You got to make sure that when you're going into that meeting, it's not the first time that you have talked about that data. And so I would say that the ones that went well, I had a chance to review and rehearse that information and the way that I was going to present it and talk through it and facilitate the discussion. Rehearse that with one of my supervisors. So early on was Lakeisha, and then currently Sarah Tracy. So having a chance to do that really with somebody who's going to give you critical and constructive feedback about your presentation style and whether you have pulled out the information that needs to be pulled out, that's really critical. I've gone into a couple of meetings without having done that. And you can imagine it just did not go well. Nothing bad happened. I don't think I lost employers or anything, but it wasn't what it could have been. And you know, people can tell if you haven't prepared for something, and that doesn't do them any service. So that's my main answer to that question. Go ahead. So how do we get them to take action? This is really, you know, the last couple of slides we've been talking about, we've moved beyond strategy 2, demand projection information. The last few moments we've talked about strategy 3 and 4. This is really getting into strategy 5. And so go ahead, next slide. I think going out, being willing to go outside of the TPM data, you know, really wrap up their data and present it to them. Like, here's what we found. What's it tell you? What do we want to do with that? Present with them with a few options, but also go outside of the TPM data. This is an example of data where I got this from a local state Kentucky post-secondary education numbers, data that they have on particular programs. So this is from my the Energy Collaborative across the state. They're looking for engineers. They've got to have a particular type of accreditation. So I found which schools have that accreditation for that program. And then I went to our post-secondary education organization's website to find what was the output in those programs over the last few years. That's what this shows. And so then we can kind of project out, like, here's what the pipeline is going to look like. Let's go talk to those schools and get something set up. So that's what I've got to share with you today, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach, for sharing that. And I think it's really important to think about all of those steps that go into it. Once you've gotten the data, what's actually going to be useful from what you've collected? How are you communicating that with your employers, and then making decisions on that? And the piece about practice too, wanting to make sure that you come into those meetings prepared, right? I remember Josh Williams, who used to be on the Kentucky team, told me a story about the very first time that he went into one of his rural Kentucky employer collaborative meetings, and he said they all looked at him like, who's this guy from Louisville coming to tell me what to do? He doesn't know anything about us. And part of it was, you know, getting to understand who you're working with, and being prepared, and developing the relationships, but also understanding the data that you're going to be talking about. So any questions for Zach? We have a couple of minutes left.
I don't have a question, but I just think I was, first off, Zach, really impressed with all of the work that you're doing, and with this presentation and all the pointers that you had. And I think, you know, recognizing that one of the, you know, that sort of the first hurdle to get over is getting the data from employers. I really liked, you know, how well you're tracking, you know, the steps you are taking to facilitate relationships and build relationships with the businesses, to get their trust and to get their participation. So I really loved that, you know, tracking your different types of interactions with them and what you might be able to do to kind of bring them on board. So kudos there. Really great stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, and the one thing I would add to that on the relationship side is even starts before you even launch the collaborative. Who are you but who are you working with to build the collaborative in the first place? So in the case of the distillers, we went through the Kentucky Distillers Association. They already have relationships with these folks. And so build off of that, become introduced to somebody. I mean, you can cold call, you know, just go bang on doors. That works, but it's harder.
All right, well, it looks like our breakout time is just about over. So if you all could join me in just thanking Zach for sharing his experience with us, and hopefully you all were able to learn something from how he kind of thinks about sharing the data that he gets out of the demand planning process with his employers to make decisions on where they'll go next. We'll see you all back in the main room in about 4 seconds.
Thank